Today, then, is the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War. So I was this morning, the booklet on the altar bears witness, in the middle of Brussels at the tomb of the unknown soldier, where His Majesty King Philippe gave a very moving speech about the idea of heroism and being heroic for peace, a speech addressed to the youth of Belgium. What makes the First World War so important in modern memory that we're commemorating it a century later? There is now not one soldier left who fought in the First World War who is still alive. They have all died, and that is not surprising given the span of human life. The answer to my question is that the First World War was uniquely covered and steeped and soaked in blood, and that there were people to report on it. In previous wars, which had been almost as horrendous in terms of the loss of life, what happened on the battlefield was not reported. But in the First World War, there were people who were educated and literate and able to write about their experiences, whereas the average soldier in any previous war had been illiterate and therefore suffered, not in silence, but suffered without a record of the suffering. And just speaking of my own original British culture, there were people who fought in the First World War who were able to write about their experiences and record them. And the experiences were uniquely bloody. So there is one famous statistic which British schoolchildren certainly learnt in my day, which is that on the 1st of July 1916, the British and the French began against the Germans the Battle of the Somme in France. And on one day, on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, discounting the German casualties, discounting the French casualties, there were 57,750 British casualties. 57,750 casualties on one day of one battle in the First World War. That, if you discount the students, is more or less the population of Leuven, wiped out on one day, in one battle, in one war. It's almost beyond imagining, and it's become engraved in British and Commonwealth and European and world hearts, the sheer scale of the destruction. And taking just one example of people who were commenting on this at the time, I spoke about him yesterday in a conference in KU Leuven, is Wilfred Owen. And Wilfred Owen was a good-looking and talented young man who was from a modest family background in the north of England. He was brought up in Birkenhead, in what was then in Cheshire in England. And he hadn't got the money to go to university, which then was expensive, but when I went to university was free and is now expensive again. Not all social progress in the United Kingdom is good. So because he couldn't go to university, he then thought his plan B was that he would become ordained somehow as an Anglican priest. And so as a route to that, which is very comforting for Lloyd and Ilse behind me, he became a parish intern in a parish in what was then Berkshire, in what's now Oxfordshire. And even then, which is the point of this sermon, he saw a huge gap between the teaching of Jesus Christ and the teaching of the gospel about what the church should be doing, in particular in relation to those who had nothing, and the behaviour of his own Anglican priests, whom he found to be lazy and unconnected with real life and entirely concerned with the business of church worship. That's nothing like Anglican priests today, of course, I can assure you. Having done his internship and not enjoyed it, because in fact he was self-taught, but he taught himself absolutely perfect French, he went to work in Bordeaux for the Berlitz language school. And he enjoyed himself there far more than he did as a parish intern. And that was 1914, when he was 21 years old. And then the war broke out. And the war took people by surprise. And Owen's first wish was to enlist with the French army, because his French was good, and the French were very happy to have foreigners fighting for them. But his mother persuaded him to return home, and so he returned home to train as the lowest rank officer, a second lieutenant, and he enlisted then in the Manchester Regiment, which was one of the large northern English regiments, and went to fight in France. And whatever illusions he'd had about the war as a place where officers and gentlemen would fight in an honourable way were, of course, exploded by his experience of combat in the trenches, of fighting and killing in conditions of unimaginable horror and dirt and filth and blood. But Wilfred Owen was a brave man, and he was a good fighter, and he was injured by a shell, a bomb exploding near him, and invalided to the military hospital called Craig Lockhart in Edinburgh. And in Edinburgh, he met another patient called Siegfried Sassoon. And Siegfried Sassoon was an established poet already published. Wilfred Owen had been writing poetry and loved poetry, but hadn't yet published anything, and Sassoon encouraged him. And so Wilfred Owen began to write poetry. And his poems are here, and since 1920, they have been constantly in print. And his poems concern the frontier between his own devout Anglican Christian faith and the experience of the horror of the trenches and the difference between the two, and not least his sense that the leadership of the Church of England was not serious enough about the experiences of ordinary people who were involved in the war. Owen could have got away with a desk job when he recovered from his shell shock, but he was determined to go back and to fight with his men, to be alongside his men, and he returned to combat in July 1918 and was killed by a German sniper bullet on the 4th of November 1918, just 1 week before the war ended, which had the result that, this is a true story, that as the armistice was being celebrated in the north of England on the 11th of November, and the church bells were ringing, the postman arrived with a telegram announcing to his mother that Wilfred had been killed. Why are his poems still on the syllabus of English schools? Why are they still read? Because they are searingly important in how they handle our faith. And I'm just going to look very briefly at two poems which are truly famous. In one of them, called The Parable of the Old Men and the Young, Owen takes the beautiful, beautiful account in Genesis 22 of the sacrifice of Isaac. Remember the story that Isaac in his old age has finally produced a son. Abraham in his old age has finally produced a son, Isaac. And God commands Abraham to take Isaac to the land of Moriah and to sacrifice him, to kill him, to prove to God that Abraham places God above all else. He demands the thing Abraham loves most, his son, his firstborn son, Isaac. And Abraham does it. He takes Isaac to the mountain and he ties him up and he stretches out his hand to kill him. And then a voice comes from heaven saying, "Do not do it. Do not do it. You have shown your absolute love for me, and that is enough. Do not sacrifice your son. There's a ram which has its horns caught in a bush. Take the ram and sacrifice the ram instead." And that has been taken by the people of Israel and by the Christians who followed the people of Israel as God's instruction in the book of Genesis not to commit infanticide, not to kill your children, not even for God. God does not require us to kill our children even for God. We'll kill something else instead, like a ram. That is the biblical teaching. And this, then, if you listen carefully, is Owen's take on that biblical teaching. So Abram rose and clave, cut the wood, and went and took the fire with him and a knife. And as they sojourned, as they stayed, both of them together, Isaac, the firstborn, spake and said, "My father, behold the preparations, fire and iron, but where is the lamb for this burnt offering?" Then Abram bound the youth with belts and straps, and builded parapets and trenches there, and stretched forth the knife to slay his son, when lo, an angel called him out of heaven, saying, "Lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do anything to him. Behold, a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Offer the ram of pride instead of him." But the old man would not so, but slew his son, and half the seed of Europe, one by one. So you see how Owen handles that biblical story. He tells in the form of a sonnet of 14 lines the story of Genesis 2 about God commanding Abraham not to sacrifice his son. But he adds 2 more lines in which he talks of his own experiences, that the elders have ignored God's teaching, and they kill Isaac, and with Isaac they kill half the men of Europe, one by one. And that was his experience of the trenches in which the whole of Western civilization was systematically being wiped out, as we saw on the 1st of July 1916 with those 57,000 casualties. And so it's a retelling of the Genesis account, but profoundly critical of the elders, profoundly critical of the leaders, who at this point were still fulsomely supporting the war on both sides. But there's even more, as it were, criticism of the church in what Owen writes. And I want to end on this because I find, as an Anglican priest, it is a very profound criticism of the leadership of my own church and of all churches at the time. Because don't forget, during the First World War, the churches in England were supporting the British, the churches in Germany were supporting the Germans. It was ever thus. And what Owen finds himself thinking is that those who wear the dog collars and those who are called reverend and father and those who appeal to apostolic succession and say we are the inheritors of the tradition begun by Jesus Christ himself have in fact betrayed the calling that they have acquired. And oddly enough, it is amongst and in the trenches themselves, the soldiers themselves, who are actually carrying out and carrying on the message of Jesus Christ in terms of their willingness to sacrifice themselves. And the last 2 lines in the poem I'm going to read out now to end this sermon are Wilfred Owen's own statement of the Christian faith and his reasons for saying, Ah, yes, the soldiers now are carrying the burden and the gospel of Christ in ways that the church has simply abandoned. It's called At a Calvary Near the Anchor. One ever hangs where shelled roads part. In this war, he too lost a limb, but his disciples hide apart, and now the soldiers bear with him. Near Golgotha strolls many a priest, and in their faces there is pride, that they were flesh-marked by the beast, by whom the gentle Christ's denied. The scribes on all the people shove and bawl allegiance to the state, but they who love the greater love lay down their life. They do not hate. I'm going to read the last two lines again as a summary of Wilfred Owen's thought. But they who love the greater love lay down their life. They do not hate. Our experience after the First World War, and don't forget, that was a war in which 16 million people died, but it was grotesquely overreached by its successor, the Second World War, in which over 60 million people died, including, of course, the 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis in the death camps. The message for Christian leaders and Christian disciples such as us is to look for where Jesus is in all that. And I think Wilfred Owen offers a very profound insight. They do not hate. Those who do not hate, those whose life experiences do not lead them into the slogans and the bawling allegiances of which Wilfred Owen speaks, they are the ones who carry Jesus Christ and his message today. They do not hate. And so if I draw one lesson from the rows and rows of tombs and gravestones that we saw as a parish earlier this year in Tyne Cot Cemetery, which is the largest of the Commonwealth war graves in Belgium, it is that. The sacrifice made by those young men as they were blown apart in the trenches 100 years ago have given us the freedom to follow Christ by not hating. They do not hate. My prayer for myself and for all of us is that we will not hate. Amen.